Thank you very much, Tim. We have about 10 or 15 minutes to take some questions. If there's any questions, we'd be happy to have the panel field them for you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Goldman, let me just start out. I'd like to ask probably the best ask Mr. Jackson. I was in Tappahannock last weekend, Tappahannock, Virginia, and I paid $1.95 a gallon for gasoline. I've also heard some things from the new administration that lead me to believe that they may relax some of the things that were put into place by the Obama administration. Are you experiencing any sort of headwinds in terms of the economics of your operation? Could you talk about how, I've worked for USDA for quite a while, and Sarah Biddleman used to be with us on the Hill. She told me that basically a lot of things are possible for $4 a gallon, but not much is possible for $2 a gallon.
Sure.
Could you?
Sure. So keep in mind, I'm speaking specifically
Excuse me. Yeah, for those folks who are listening in who might not be able to have heard the question involves, how do we deal with the economics of biofuels versus traditional petroleum-based fuels? And Sam, you want to take that on?
Sure. So keep in mind, I'm speaking specifically from the biomass supply side. There's a significant portion of that liquid fuel cost in the conversion technology. But as a supplier to that industry, we're always under pressure. There has not been a time where we have not faced headwinds on you've got to get costs down, you've got to get better feedstock in, those kinds of things. So certainly we're working to address that. From our business perspective, though, when I look at the volume of biofuel business, liquid fuel business versus biochemical, bioproduct, more, I don't want to say necessarily consumer-driven demand, but markets that are being created outside of some of the policy-related aspects of all of this, we have seen a shift, and not just in the last, month or 2 months, but over the last year or two of our business shifting percentage-wise more toward biochemicals and bioproducts. And that's simply because I think there's a little bit more investment certainty in those marketplaces, and so companies that are making multiple decade investments in new technologies and equipment and things like that, new products, it's a little more certainty. Now that said, on the biofuel side though, certainly, price is everything in the marketplace when the consumer drives up to the gas pump. And that certainly, the low cost certainly provides some challenges in that aspect. But speaking as a supplier, there hasn't been a day where we've not said, okay, how do we do this more efficiently, less cost, that kind of thing for the customer, for the end user, because we're in a unique position where we're trying to balance a landowner or a producer that wants to get the maximum return for his production, and we've also got an end user that wants that biomass to come in at the absolute lowest cost that they can always get. And I think you've seen, the realities of that set in. A number of years ago, everybody was like $30 a ton biomass. Welcome to the real world. It's a little more costly than that. But the point is, we're always trying to reduce that cost. And we certainly can play a component, depending on the technology. Feedstock could account for as little as 25% of the end fuel cost, as much as 50%, just depending on that technology. So certainly it plays a big role, and that is something that we have to try to overcome in today's climate.
So if no one else is going to comment, there are some real opportunities when you consider our large petroleum companies really work on a humongous scale that just dwarfs what we're currently doing with biofuels. There are still opportunities like alternative jet fuel. Alternative jet fuel, for example, it actually has a market waiting for the delivery of the material through the military and civil aviation. And those companies, like the airlines and equipment manufacturers, have been actually stepping up to assist in the development of smaller companies who are willing to have a smaller return on investment initially to get into the marketplace and move forward. And so that seems to be one of the areas that small vehicle liquid transportation fuels in the U.S. is sort of a market that's either static or declining. But when you consider that that alternative jet fuel is internationally mandated, and the regulations, whether they're here in the U.S. or not, if you want to fly into Europe, you may actually have to be required to fly with some level of renewable fuel in your tank. So there are opportunities out there, and I think I'll leave it at that. Next question. Yes, sir.
Let me try that one again. Well, actually, I won't go that way, because I know we won't get an answer. Tim, you said that the Southeast, you're gearing up to produce 50% of the cellulosic biofuels. Can you tell us how many million gallons a year of cellulosic biofuels and biochemicals are being produced in the Southeast now? And what would 50%, how many millions of gallons that is, and what do you see as the primary roadblocks to achieving that?
Yeah, before Tim responds, for those folks who aren't in the room, the question is, the Southeast, Dr. Rouse stated in his presentation that the Southeast has the potential to produce up to 50% of the fuels and the biomass to produce fuels and chemicals. And the question from the floor is, when you consider if it was 50% level was reached, about how many gallons would that be, and where are we now relative to that goal?
And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull any of those numbers out of my head, frankly. Well,
I'm glad they asked you.
Maybe the one of where are we right now? And where we are right now is still very much in the early development stages. We've seen industries move into the region and not be successful. A couple of high-profile companies that you can think of that, and in many ways, where that has reflected the challenges, and that there's still opportunities to improve the efficiencies of the conversion processes, but also there's that limitation of really matching the technologies with the feedstock that is in place. So much of the work that's been done in the Southeast has been around the forest products residues, the forest residues, which presents some very real challenges in terms of quality and purity of the material. So that's been a major limitation there. There's lots of activity still in looking at especially biochemical conversion, and especially in South Louisiana, I believe there's work and demonstrations underway there. Another in North Carolina, there are operations, but it has not taken off in the region in a way that we had hoped as yet.
Okay. Question over here, please.
Yes, thank you. This is for Dr. Riles and others. So some of the models for the cellulosic biorefineries indicate that the fuel piece would be offshoot of producing more high-value chemicals, and that some of that work is being done right now to develop those. Can you comment on what looks into the future to be the biggest opportunity for what types of chemicals and what types of markets to follow?
So the question for those who aren't available to hear it, if I understood correctly, is when you're looking at cellulosic biorefineries, it turns out that the fuel is not the largest economic driver, and what other opportunities are there, and what other portfolio of chemicals or products are on the horizon that would make these biorefineries successful?
And thank you for the question. I think as we think about the economics and the efficiencies of especially the biochemical platform, we feel like one of the real opportunities or one of the real needs is to think about how we're pre-treating and how we're looking at this biomass source. So currently we use what's called the sugars, or the sugar component, the carbohydrate component, that is really the raw material for fuel production. And so the challenge with that approach is, you know, we invest all this money into growing the biomass crop, into harvesting, into transporting, into pre-processing, and at the end of the day, we actually use less than half of that material to make a product. And so the real need is to expand the use of the other half of that material. So we have a lot of work, and there's lots of industry and other work underway to advance alternative markets or new markets for that other part of the material. The other part of the material that we've been focused on for many years is called lignin. So lignin is you know, the lignocellulose component there, and lignin is has not been a really particularly valuable product for many years, but creates a lot of opportunities and presents a lot of potential. Much of the work with lignin continues to focus on its use as a polymer component. So it has been incorporated and advanced as a resin system for adhesive bonding in different kinds of applications, and there's very real advances underway there. Considerable work over the course of the last, call it 5 years, in looking at lignin as a precursor for carbon materials. So we've seen some advances in lignin as a battery, essentially a battery component for energy storage, also for carbon fiber production. Now, quite a bit of work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, UT, a number of labs around the world have investigated this direction. It's very attractive because carbon fiber is a very high value product, a very high value market, and a very large volume market. And really, if we begin to think about this industry as it grows and expands, we start to think about an awful lot of material that's coming out of there. So that target of carbon fiber, other kinds of carbon products, for example, carbon foam for heat management and other innovative functional kinds of materials like that, is one where considerable progress has been advanced, and really where a lot of the industry is directing their attention at the moment as well. That gets us up to considerably more than the 30–40% that we're using of the biomass right now.
Well, Tim's given us some great examples. I'll just give one more. A couple of days ago in Biofuels Digest, they reported about a company called Gevo that can make alternative jet fuel through an alcohol-to-jet process from isobutanol. Isobutanol itself is a chemical intermediate that has some good value to it. And when you convert isobutanol into isoparaffinic kerosene or jet fuel, you end up with other chemicals like isooctane, and they just signed an offtake agreement with a racing company to use this for a racing fuel for like Formula One and that sort of thing. So you're looking for an integrated portfolio of options, and that can go in the direction of market pull. Next question, sir. You had.
I wanted to add one thing to that
sorry.
real quickly. We actually are working with 2 customers today that are taking biomass simply to fractionate it out into chemical building blocks. That's their end product. So you look at things that are traditionally coming from petroleum today that go into plastics and polymers and other things. These 2 companies, their sole technology is focused on bio-based replacements to those chemical building blocks. And they've been very successful with that so far.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. Sir, you've been very patient. Could you speak up a little bit? I'm sorry.
My name is Steve Petrella. I'm with the USDA Rural Utility Services, the Electric Program. My question's for Kevin Bauer. I noticed you, in your case you're talking about with biofuel. One of the big things, I guess, it's a very big investment with the biomass burning. Is there a significant amount of turnover with, biomass producers? Are you constantly searching for? It's a 2-part question, really. How that has to be very stressful to try and find, viable, asset to burn, I
So that
Sure,
project.
excuse me, Kevin, for the folks that aren't in the room, the question pertains to biopower generation, and where does the biomass come from? Or how do you identify producers who are willing to participate?
So that was a demonstration project, as I mentioned earlier. The utility at that time was trying to evaluate their options for dealing with potential carbon regulations or renewable portfolio standards. And that was one of the strategies that they wanted to pursue. So essentially, because it was a demonstration project at that time, primarily intended to demonstrate and test the technical feasibility of being able to do that at a commercial scale on an ongoing basis, we had to have a pilot program with USDA that allowed us to harvest that material from CRP fields. So it was, 2 ton per acre type grassland. Very little perennial crops were established as part of that project. So in order to build the inventory of 25,000 tons that we needed in order to accomplish that 3-month continuous test burn, we had to reharvest those fields. It was 4,000 acres. We had to reharvest and then store that material over a number of years in order to build up that inventory. And that was, part of the reason that the expenses that would be involved in that supply chain, if they were to build out that operation on a continuous basis, plus the low value end product was really why that project didn't go forward. They essentially ended up building and buying large wind to meet their carbon and renewables needs. So that gets back to some of the other questions about needing a high value product, and some of the things that Tim and Bill and Sam have been mentioning would enable that supply chain to be developed. And Sam's had a ton of experience down in the Southeast with working with landowners where they've established the grass crops there. I also think that there are opportunities for modifications in existing USDA programs or conservation programs. I mean, they're very well known and characterized from a landowner's perspective. They get annual rental payments that they've come to understand, how that works from their perspective. It pays for part of the cost for establishing those materials. And one of the projects that we're currently working on is looking at the potential for those small modifications and those types of programs to be able to start establishing a base, like a biomass reserve of those types of materials through familiar programs to landowners that reduce their risk, but also incrementally allow the opportunity to build that supply so that it's there when an end user needs it.
So we're just about at the end of our time. Does anybody have a question that can be answered really quickly? If not, please join me in thanking the panel. Appreciate your attention.